This is my review slash overview, continuing from my previous video on the Growatt SPF 3000 LVM. These are the 48 volt inverters. This is going over the monitoring app, in addition to just my experience and insights and what I've ran across while using these inverters so far. So for this, you can go to server.growatt.com, and that will allow you to log into here. You can create your account. There's also a little demo account, so you can play with that as well. There's also an app for your phone. I have an Android, so in the case of that, it's the Growatt Shine app. I don't know if there's an equivalent one in the Apple App Store, but I would imagine that there probably is. Somebody else would have to check on that though. But this allows you to do your basic setup and then monitoring of data. So let's begin. Alright, so we are now logged into the app, and as you can see, you've got your basic little information throughout here. It's pretty well built out. I like the general usage of it. Really not had much of any way of any issues. Since these are the off-grid storage inverters, basically, so these are listed as device type storage. And then each one's serial number will basically show up here. So I have two of them, so there's two different numbers, and you'll see there different values for each. Little data source diagram, that sort of thing. Not a huge amount of information as far as that goes, but in this little bubble here, this is actually showing you the information from your inverters. Now, this app logs data every 5 minutes, so it's not real time, but every 5 minutes it takes another little snapshot and updates this app. So you get a pretty good amount of information throughout the day that you can check on things. And as you can see, right now my battery voltage 54.3, my PV1, PV2, 76 volts there. I've got 42 amps of charging current out of that 2319 watts of power that was coming through there. Total charge current, that sort of thing. Your input, your output voltage, and then load percentage on this particular inverter at that time. So I was consuming about 1400 watts, so about 48% of that particular inverter's capacity. Switch over to the other one, and I think some clouds literally just rolled over just a second ago, but you can see same type of data under here. You've got your battery voltage, so now I'm probably pulling a little bit of power from the batteries as that cloud moved over, and but it'll jump back up in just a second. Yep, I'm looking at my BMS little battery monitor, and I don't know if you can hear the fans in the background, but they just spun up because the solar just picked back up. But same thing, 27% of the load, etc. on this guy. You have your little boxes over here. So this is solar, how much I've generated in solar on that particular inverter today. It's total lifetime generated solar. Storage production. Really haven't been using much out of the storage at all today, so there's not really much there. And then 333 kilowatt hours it's saying that I've consumed from that. Charged, grid consume, load consumption, all those types of things. And in the little map over here, you can see, since we've switched off the grid, drawing from the solar and battery, we currently have 0 watts coming from the grid. Now, unlike some of the inverters that are out there that are able to pull power from both the grid and from solar and battery, this is one or the other. This is not going to be able to pull power in from the grid at the same time it's also supplying power from there, because remember, these are not grid tied inverters. They do not feed anything back, and so it either switches to the grid or from the grid. When it switches from the grid, there is no ability for it to feed anything back. So if you're in one of those areas where you're going to set these guys up and you're don't want to get in trouble for for feeding things back into the grid that you don't have a permit for, these definitely will not feed anything back. So then you got solar, you got your wattage coming into here, a certain amount of the power is going to the battery, and then the rest of it to the load. And you can see over here, same kind of deal, certain amount of power coming in. Now this discharge power is probably not actually coming from the batteries. This is probably being made up for by the extra solar that's coming in on the other set of inverters. So that's one of the things that, is a little funky to kind of figure out those numbers, but it all makes sense for the most part. Scroll on down, and this is the nice little chart that it creates for your 24-hour period. So starting at midnight, it switches over each, got a new grid for every 24 hours, and it goes midnight to midnight. And you can see where, there was no solar coming in, obviously, at midnight. And since yesterday was overcast and rainy, and we didn't really generate a whole lot of solar, it had long since switched back to pulling power from the grid. And so so there's my load consumption, 903 watts, and I'm consuming 903 watts from the grid. And it just, goes up and down all throughout it as, power draws from there. And you can see, somewhere around 7:15, I guess, in the morning is when the sun started to come up enough that a tiny little bit of power was starting to generate. So I got about 6 watts of solar, and then it slowly ramps up and continues on up, throughout there. A little bit of clouds, and then as the clouds got out of the way, we start generating a little bit more juice. So I have about 3,000 watts of solar feeding into each of these two arrays, or each of these two inverters, about 3,000 watts on each side. It's more like 3,000 watts on one side and about 3,400 watts on the other side, but they're relatively evenly matched, but they are aimed slightly differently to maximize production throughout the day, given the complexities of my yard, basically, with trees on either side of my property. So you can see, here's the bit of, up and down as the clouds have come through, and or as the battery has filled up. And then you can also see this little green line here. That's where it's saying storage production, where it's pulling power. And like I said, if you're producing excess solar on the other one, it'll actually basically offset what it thinks it's consuming from the battery on this one. So you're not really actually pulling anything from the battery. You're just, consuming it from the other inverter. So in addition to that, you can go up under here under the energy tab, and this will show you, your 24-hour period and actual time. These are your, again, every 5 minutes it's logging, it's a little bit of data, and you can see where the power has spiked up and down based on solar generation. You select them both, and you can see this is inverter 1, inverter 2 is how much solar power they've actually generated throughout there, depending on clouds, overcast, all of that type of stuff. You go over here to day, then it'll actually break it down to day, and most days they're pretty evenly balanced. In these days it was relatively cool. I wasn't using a whole lot of power, and basically the batteries were full at this point, so it essentially ramped down the solar production on one inverter and just use the solar production from the other inverters who basically power everything that it needed to power. So that's why you see this big difference in generation for this. If my battery bank was larger and I was able to store more power, I probably would have a bar that would be relatively evenly matched like I have most other days. I've got about 14 kilowatt hours of storage. My plan is to expand that further, but at any given point, the set point that I have these guys set on to switch back leaves me with about 40% of my storage capacity left in there. So the way I have these guys set up is my first set point that it hits is that set point that I have in there for it to switch from grid, or switch from battery back to grid. and that leaves me with about 40% of my battery capacity remaining. And that's handy so that if the power goes out in the middle of the night, I'm not having to jump up out of bed to go shut off a bunch of things to keep it from running out of battery before morning comes up. We just don't use a whole lot of power overnight. There's not a heavy amount of draw, and that 40%, 40 to 45% that's left in there should generally get me to morning. The ceiling fan in my bedroom is not on the solar system. It's on. It's directly attached to the grid, and so power goes out, that ceiling fan basically shuts off. There's also a laser printer that I have in there as well, and if that power goes out, it shuts itself down. When the power comes back on, it spins itself back up. But a lot of times, if that fan cuts off, that will usually actually wake up myself or my wife, and we know that, hey, power's out. Okay, I can get out of bed, cut off a couple of the mini split air conditioners to save some additional power. But middle of the night, we're just not using that much power, so normally it'd be enough to get to morning so I can get up and turn off some things that I would need to turn off if I needed to, or if I had to fire up the generator to supply some additional power. The other set point that you can set in there is your low voltage disconnect, and that's basically you set that whatever safety point that you want for your batteries. In the case of this, I have mine set at around, basically be the equivalent of about 10% of the battery remaining. And so when you hit that point, it'll shut itself off, and then my battery management system, the BMS on the batteries, it's actually set to cut them off when they hit to around 5 or 6%. So in this case, the inverter should shut off before the BMS ever cuts it off, because if the BMS has to cut it off first, that'll give you an error message on your inverters saying, hey, you got no battery, things aren't happy. At that point, you really don't want your BMS to be shutting things off before the inverters do. You want the inverters, so set your low voltage disconnect on the inverters to cut off before that BMS does. In my particular setup, I have 3,000 watts of solar going into the one inverter. It's 6 strings of panels going into it. Each string is 250 watt sun power, 72 volt or 72 cell panels, excuse me. And so that's 3,000 watts of solar going into the one inverter. The other inverter has 2 strings of those, and then I ended up with a kind of crazy deal from a local guy that was a independent installer that went to work for somebody else, and he had a stack of a bunch of panels that were almost all of them identical, 300 watt 60 cell panels. And so I got a bunch of those from him, and so on that second inverter, it has 2 strings of those sun power, so 1,000 watts, 2 500 watt strings of those, and then it has 3 additional strings that each string is made of 3 of the 60 cell panels in series. Those are 300 watt panels, and then those 3 strings together, parallel together. So their voltage is a little bit higher than what the sun powers are, which means they're only going to match voltage-wise with the sun power. So I'm losing a little bit of wattage, but I'm still getting a good 800 watts out of the 900 watts of solar panels in each of those 3. So, and being that I only paid about $22 for each of those panels, it doesn't really matter that much that I'm losing that little bit of extra on each one of those strings. And so that gives me again a little over 3,000 watts on that one, and it balances out pretty well. The overall system has ran very smoothly. Really haven't had any issues at all. I talked about in the previous video, I had a issue initially where when I went to connect them up, turn them on, one of the units was giving me an error message, and I discovered it was literally when I went to put when I was attaching the wires to the main breaker that was feeding them, one of the 2 wires, the wire actually kind of slipped underneath where the little screw clamp would be, and so it wasn't actually in the clamp, so it wasn't connected to anything, and it immediately threw an error message saying, hey, you know, these are set up for split phase, but it's not seeing split phase, so if there was an error, it wasn't allowing it to start up. So, you know, safety features in that case actually worked like they're supposed to. So once I corrected that, that took care of the problem. No more issues. You know, we have a Frigidaire, you know, standard like $600 or so dollar, you know, fridge slash freezer. You know, top freezer at the top, and normal fridge at the bottom. Nothing fancy. Decent Energy Star ratings for it. And we bought that about 6 years ago or so. It runs that, no issues starting it, no problems of that sort. I have two mini split air conditioners. One's a 18,000 BTU unit, 18 SEER, and the other one's a 12,000 BTU unit, also 18 SEER, that are powered by these guys. And then I have a 5,000 BTU, little 110 volt window unit. Now both of the mini splits, those are 240 volt units, split phase, and then the window unit is just, you know, a standard 110 one. We have that in the bedroom. We like to keep the bedroom cooler than the rest of the house, so, you know, that allows us to keep that one room nice and cold for at night, while the rest of the house can be at a much more reasonable temperature, and, you know, reducing the amount of power that we need to consume in a given day. The inverters themselves, the fans will spin up and down based on solar load or inverter load. So if you've got a lot of inverter load on it, or if there's a lot of solar coming in, the fans will spin up, keep everything inside of them nice and cool. My plan is probably, you know, once a year to pull the front covers off of these guys, you know, go through there and blow out everything dust-wise, make sure everything is fine. Probably going to also pull the model number on the fans and see if I can find aftermarket or actual legitimate Growatt fans, whichever, so I can put a couple of those on the shelf, because, you know, anybody who's familiar with any of these types of equipment, eventually fans have a tendency to go out, and it'd be nice to have a spare on the shelf for whenever that happens down the road. But, you know, so far everything is running extremely well. I have 3 chest freezers running on these guys. I've got my washer and dryer. I have a Fisher Paykel washer and dryer set going on. I think I've had that washer and dryer set going on almost 14 years now. It's their high efficiency top load type washer, and it's a gas dryer. So it's not really using a whole lot of power for the dryer, other than just to, you know, run the blower and spin it. Runs those with no issues. That washing machine does not have really high load, even in spin or anything of that sort, because it's a direct drive motor to the bottom of it. If you ever want a washing machine that lasts for years and years and years and is easy to work on, that Fisher Paykel, man, I've gotten my money's worth out of it. Bought the thing for about $330 or $340, I think it was, on clearance at Lowe's, because it had a little dent in the back of it, a spot you can't even see. You know, over the years, I had to replace the little diverter. There's a little diverter valve that's in there. There's the little water pump that basically circulates the water and stuff through there. You know, I think the valve was $60 or so. The little pump piece was like $80 or so for that. After about 10 years, it's got these, you know, 4 little shock columns in the 4 corners of the guy. Those kind of, you know, were worn out by that point. It's again about $80 or $100, I think, for the replacement shock towers to replace those. And then last year I finally replaced there's the valve section for opening and closing the hot water sources to it. You know, the little rubber grommets and stuff inside there had finally gotten somewhat hard and would occasionally drip while it was just, you know, sitting there off. But, you know, again, I've spent $350 or so on this thing, probably in parts over the years, maybe $400. but none of these repairs took more than about 20 or 30 minutes to do it. I mean, and it just continues to run. You know, I couldn't have bought a equivalent new washing machine for the parts that I've spent in the thing over the years, and it just runs and runs and runs and runs. So they're really fantastic. But anyway, so that, you know, it runs those, no issues. I've got you know, several lights in the house on this system. I have my home theater, all my computer equipment, that's all on this system as well. My wife's uses CPAP machine at night, and that's powered by this as well, which is nice in the fact that you don't have to worry about, you know, power going out and that particular unit not working. It's just, you know, it's basically covered through this, so she doesn't have to, you know, wake up in the middle of the night if there's a power outage. So it's basically kind of acting like a UPS in that situation. If you had major starting loads or something that had a really surgy type starting load, these may not be the ideal setup for you, depending on what that peak output is. These are a high frequency inverter, so because of that, you know, there are 3,000 watts per inverter. So in my case, you know, 3,000 watts in each of the two phases, or 6,000 watts combined. They can surge up to double that for, I think it's 4 or 5 seconds. So, you know, you're looking at 6,000 watts in each one for, you know, up to about 4 seconds or so, or 12,000 watts combined. But if you had, you know, if you have things that, you know, spike up into, you know, a 110 volt load, for instance, that like some of these, you know, chop saws or things like that, that they spike up to 10 or 12,000 watts for that initial starting, these are probably not the ideal thing to run those types of things off of. You know, you may want to put in a separate, you know, low frequency inverter that you only use for those particular types of loads, if that was the situation. Alternately, you can add additional of these inverters in parallel, so that you can expand, you know, provided of course your wiring coming into it is rated for the load, but you can expand it. And you don't have to expand it in, you know, you have 2 to start with, you don't have to put in 2. If you're, you know, if your loads are mostly 110 and on one particular phase versus the other, you can throw in one additional inverter on that one phase, and so that one phase would have 6,000 watts of 120 volt power, versus the other phase would only have 3,000 watts. And so long as your wiring and everything is you know, rated for it, you would be able to pull that extra power for those 110 volt loads. You know, I'm actually considering looking at adding one more of these inverters, because I have some additional 110 volt loads that I'd like to put on this. I don't really have any, you know, other 240 volt loads that I'm looking to put on these inverters. I mean, I've got a, you know, an electric oven, but that thing draws like 5,000 watts all by itself. I'm probably not looking at throwing that on this type of system anytime soon. But, you know, again, I could, if I put two of these units in, another one on either side, so that would give me 6,000 watts on each phase, or 12,000 watts, you know, combined. At that point, I'd be able to run that load no problem whatsoever. So you can grow this down the road as your needs, etc., expand, and as long as you keep adding that little Shine USB module to each one, you're going to get all of the logging information and stuff in there. So, you know, when I look at potentially adding in that additional inverter later on, what I would then what I could then do is, I've got right now I have 2 smaller, about 1100 watt arrays that are feeding into separate charge controllers that are charging the batteries that are independent of all of this system. But that also means I don't really get to see the data in this system. For what they're producing, I have to look in, I'm using Victron controllers, so I have to, you know, I can look at that through the little Bluetooth app, or if I get one of their data logging modules, I could log it, you know, and view it via that. Alternately, if I put in another one, I could take those two smaller arrays, connect it directly to the charge controller that's in that one, and I have all my data in one source, able to see it. So, you know, they're very flexible as far as that goes. I've had these guys in place, like I said, since the middle of March. And one of the things you'll see under my energy tab, if you look at month, so you can see, this is when I initially got them, and before we realized that you needed the little USB module on each of the two units. And so this was when I was switching it back and forth, trying to figure out how we could get it to read the information from both. And well, the long and short of it is you can't. You have to have a module on each one. So you can see April, May, and June, I only had information from one of the two units on a daily basis, or on a monthly basis even. Because during that time, once we figured it out, Ian had already sold out of the USB modules he had. They were on back order. With COVID and everything else, you couldn't really get them. So once they came back into stock, and I put it in, I think literally towards the beginning of July, and then from that point forward, you can see I've got data from both of the units going forward from that point on, which is kind of handy as far as that goes. And if I had a third unit, there'd just be another little bar here that would show you the data and stuff coming out of that particular unit. So overall, I've been really happy with it. As I've put in the description and stuff for my first video on this, these units I bought them myself. I wasn't paid anything for it. I was looking around initially. I had considered the MPP solar, that 5,000 watt split phase inverter unit that's out there. I think David Paz and some other folks have reviewed that guy as well. But the reason I went with these was twofold. First, for about the same price, I think it's within 100 or 200 bucks of each other, you get 500 watts more per phase with this setup. So 6,000 watts combined, 3,000 watts in each phase versus 5,000 watts combined and 2,500 watts on each phase. Having that extra bit of wattage, has absolutely been beneficial. It's not often that I get above 2,500 watts in each phase, but I have actually gotten up to that point, and I would be really at the limits with that with the MPP solar one. And then the other side of it is that, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing equivalent to this Growatt dashboard monitoring system available for those MPP solar guys. You've got your normal little app or software that you can connect to a computer and do your logging and stuff on that, but I don't believe that there's anything equivalent to this Growatt dashboard deal via phone or anything else. And it's really handy to be able to see all the data from it and log it and know what you've got. So that was the other bit. I think initially when Ian was selling these things back then, he was offering like $100 off of your order if you did a review or whatever. At that time I planned on doing it, but didn't really get around to it at that time, and I really wanted to let these guys run for a few months to see how do they work, how do they run, have I been happy with the output, and quite honestly, I've been really happy. I've had no issues. I haven't had the system shut down on me, or I haven't overloaded it or done anything of that sort. And part of it is just planning out, making sure that your loads that you're putting on this meets what this system can handle. I've got in my kitchen, I've got a little Gold Star microwave that I bought back over 20 years ago when I was in the Army. Little 1,200 watt job, and I've got a little 1,300 watt little toaster oven. Those are on one of the phases of this particular system. That particular phase doesn't have a huge amount of loads. In its normal everyday usage, it gets up to 1,400 watts. Is about peak. So when I kick on that microwave, at most I'm hitting 2,600 if everything else is maxed out. If I'm kicking on the toaster oven, I'm hitting 2,600, 2,700 if everything else is maxed out. So I'm never reaching the 3,000 watt maximum, and the normal day-to-day usage, it's setting down at around 1,000 watts or less, typically drawn on that thing. Now, if I put those loads on the other inverter where I have, in the case of that bedroom window AC unit that draws, 300 to 500 watts of power, on its use with everything else, that leg there sets at, closer to 1,800 to 2,000 watts peak at any given time. If I put those loads on there, I would be tripping that inverter. So again, plan out your loads as far as that goes, and you don't have those issues. And so because of that, I've never had that issue as far as it goes. They just continue to run, and I've been really, really happy with the setup. And cost-wise, I mean, I've got $6,500, $6,800 bucks or so into my entire setup, which is about a total of about 8,000 watts of solar, about 14 kilowatt hours of battery storage, the 2 inverters. I do have, as I showed at the end of the video of the one previously, I do have a smaller little 375 watt Victron 48 volt inverter that's directly connected to this battery bank, and that particular inverter I use to run the lights in this office and a couple of the other rooms, kitchen and our basically main living room. That way, if I have to shut these inverters off to do maintenance or something of that sort, I'm not having to shut off all the lights too. I still have the overhead lights that are directly powered from the battery bank via that smaller inverter. So if I ever had to do maintenance or anything like that, I still got a little bit of juice. And then I'm looking at more than likely Victron makes a 1,200 watt inverter as well in that same little series, and I'm looking at getting one of those so that just to throw on a shelf, so that if I needed to directly connect something to the battery bank, an emergency type use or whatever, or I may use it to power some of the stuff in my little shop, that I can have a source that I can power directly from it, that again is outside of the Growatt system itself. All in all, been really happy with it. Hopefully this is helpful. If you got any questions, feel free to ask. Drop your comments in the piece below and let me know. Take care.